All right. Well, I want to welcome you back to our reading group. I'm going to share the screen here, and we're looking at these household codes in Ephesians. So last time we looked at the children's relationship to their parents, and Paul is dignifying them by speaking to them about speaking to them directly, um, addressing them. And this is something that's not done in household code. So Paul is dignifying the party that was generally thought to be in least control. So last time we looked at children and their parents. Paul switches to look at fathers, and we see that he says, "Don't aggravate them. Don't aggravate your children. Don't provoke them to anger, but rather nourish them in instruction, paideia, and nouthesia, kuriou, instruction and correction in the Lord." So in verse 5, we're going to see he's going to address the last set of three of these relationships: slaves or servants. Servants obviously would be less offensive for us to use, but these were slaves, and the type of slavery that existed obviously is different than modern slavery. So we have to keep that in mind. And actually, modern slavery is not one kind of thing. Um, it's a sad fact. I've heard that there are more people in slavery now than ever in human history. So I don't know why that doesn't surprise me, but all kinds of trafficking, sex trafficking, and other kinds of slave labor situations, and it's pretty awful. So some people would be mad even that Paul seems to speak to slavery in such a way that he assumes it's a reality, that they have to just do it, and doesn't advocate for their freedom in Ephesians. In fact, for some people, this is a betrayal of Paul, because how could Paul do this? Well, we have to, as we're getting started here, just thinking about this passage, we have to recognize that this is a circular letter and is um, not meant for just individuals. If you want to see a letter that is more written to Christian households, we'd have to look at Philemon. And in that situation, Paul does say Onesimus should be set free. Now, there's some extenuating circumstances there, but regardless, Paul there advocates for setting someone free. Now, we also have First Corinthians, where Paul, in I think it's chapter 7, says you should remain in the situation in which you come to the Lord, in a sense. Like, understand that the Lord has called you in circumstances. But then he addresses the issue of slavery, and he says, but if you're a slave and you can get your freedom, by all means do that. So there in First Corinthians 7, there is an acknowledgement that there's a possibility of becoming free. And again, he's writing to specific people in Corinth, probably still, though this is an open letter circulating in Achaia. Um, so there he is talking, about a particular issue of, is it right for a man to touch a woman, or something like that in First Corinthians 7. So there's a possibility, if you can get your freedom, go ahead and do it. Now, when we come to Ephesians, we're not even given, slaves aren't even encouraged in that way, at least explicitly. So um, So that could be concerning. Why doesn't he even say, "Hey, if you get a chance, get your freedom"? Is that assumed? Is it assumed that they would do that? Is that kind of the standard assumption for slaves, though, of this day? And of course, we need to understand that slavery was not uniform. Now, it wasn't uniform then. So there's different kinds of slave owner relationships, and some of them were quite good, actually. Though the slaves were running businesses on the side. They were considered family members. Um, so we know that the type of slavery really just it depended, and so maybe this explains why Paul doesn't explicitly say, "Hey, get your freedom if you can," um, but and it also may be an assumption. And we have in Corinthians Paul making that assumption explicit in a particular context, which wasn't primarily dealing with slavery. It was dealing with this issue of marriage and remaining single or not, and these kinds of things. So there's a little bit of a different context there, um, where maybe Paul felt he had the freedom to say, "Hey, get your freedom," whereas maybe in this kind of document, which is a circular document, speaking of these foundational relationships in households, maybe that would have been too subversive to say directly in that context, when he's squarely dealing with these fundamental relationships within the average households. But I do think that it's interesting how he ends. We'll see his discourse to the servants or slaves, um, with the possibility of, whether slave or free. And that, to me, that's quite pregnant, in terms of the implication. It almost would seem to suggest you could be free. So we'll see. There are constraints here, that Paul is working with. I think the openness of the letter, working with the three major relationships in a pretty square, direct way, may have caused Paul to need to be careful, careful in how direct he could talk about matters of freedom, although I think it is implied. Okay, so let's jump into the text here. We have another vocative, doulou, upo kuate, tis kata sarka, kurius, meta phobu, ke tromu en aploteti tes cardias umon osto Christo. All right, if you're wanting really clean Greek reading, I'm not the guy. There are, I don't know if you've realized, but there are some, if you've seen our proof text podcasts, there's a guy by the name of Jesse Orloff. Here's a shout out to Jesse. He's reading through big chunks of Koine Greek text, and he's a really good reader. So if you haven't heard those podcasts, you can listen to large chunks of text being read. Acts, I think he did Mark, maybe other portions of text. Okay, so this is a vocative. The plural form of vocatives looks like the nominative. Hupakuate. This is a present imperative. This verb takes the dative case for its direct object. Verbs of commanding or ordering often do so. Here we have a nice sandwich technique. You have the modifier, katasarka, according to the flesh, or in the realm of the flesh, the word lords. That's the katasarka is a type of modifier put into the first attributive position. So the masters in regard to the flesh. Now, what this implies is that there's another master, and that's going to come up later, that there's another master that is in the heavens, and this is going to come up when Paul addresses the masters. So when he addresses the masters, the lords, he's saying that there's another Lord in the heavens. So this is quite significant. So even here, there's a bit of a distancing of um, of that. So I'm going to go ahead and do some marking just because I like to do marking. So we got vocative, which is a special use of the noun cases. So we put those into curly braces, single underline the verb, cut it off, it's second plural. So I'm just doing my constituent marking method. If you haven't seen that, I'm releasing a whole bunch of videos marking through First Corinthians 12 and 13. I'm going to keep working through 14 following. This is a great method for learning Greek. I teach it in my Kine Greek grammar. And yeah, it's very easy to do. Look, I'm not changing word order, and I'm simply marking things, and so I can see what's modifying what. And then here's a subordinate clause. We're starting a subordinate clause there. And yeah, I'll stop it like that. So there we go. That's the marking. So let's translate that. Obey your earthly matters with fear and trembling, in sincerity of your heart as to Christ. Okay, now meta here probably is indicating manner. I'm trying to write out manner there. It's kind of doesn't look very good. But meta phobu ke tromu. Yeah, so manner with fear and trembling. That seems rather severe. Um, that seems rather severe. I mean, if Paul is advocating for servants to be treated well, why is he saying that they should have the servile kind of demeanor? Well, I'm suspecting that this language, just like we saw, that the wives are to fear um, their husbands, revere, fear. It's the same word it's used regarding husbands and wives in relation to husbands. And if we go back to 521, um, believers are to submit to one another in the fear of Christ. So this fear is, I think this is a different word than our understanding of fear. Um, it has to do with like a reverence, like a deep kind of reverence, and I think a respect and fear that's befitting of the position maybe or the yeah, the role that a person has. So yeah, these ideas of fear, I mean, because in counseling today, you know, and I have a counseling friend, we talk about fear-based living, anxiety-based living, and these aren't good things. These are, I mean, it's not good. Also, we know from our about our bodies um, to be living in a sense of anxiety and worry and fear actually is not good for our what is our sympathetic system, like our can really just kind of be really bad for us, enhance our pain, inflammation, all this kind of stuff. So this fear and trembling can't be meant in the same way as we understand fear and trembling today. I just don't think it can be the same. It's we could. I think more work needs to be done on this. Is this kind of social coded language? Is it kind of using the technically right words, but not meaning them quite at a surface level? Is this subversive discourse? I'm thinking particularly of the work of Dr. Roji George, he's a visiting scholar from India, visiting seminary for a year. He just spoke last week at the Biblical Studies Gathering here about his understanding of how we approach texts, and we need to approach them understanding that they're under empire, in the sense that they need to mimic the discourse, mimic, but also mock it. And we need to do both. Mock it means to show where there's differences. So it may be that this language is mimicking the language, but as we're going to see, there's a mockery. There's going to be a turning of it, provoking in a way that is really, really, really important. And so we need to see the whole thing in its context. So I'll point that back to you. It really has me thinking, this idea of the need to mimic, but also to mock. And that we see this a lot in Paul. I think Jesus's life, I was going to ask him a question about Jesus's life, but it's clear that Jesus is mimicking, looking like a Messiah, but he's also subverting that understanding quite radically in our scripture texts. In our lectionary reading in the Christian calendar right now, we're in Lent. We're reading through Mark and the Passion predictions, where Jesus obviously shows himself to be a suffering Messiah, and that's a different kind of Messiah. Of course, Peter does not want that. He openly, parasia, in boldness, he confronts Jesus, and Jesus rebukes him, and calls him out. That satanic thinking. Get behind me, Satan. So yeah, I'm just, grammatically, this is describing manner. We need to look at these terms. What do they mean? Um, in singleness of heart, aploteti. I really like this word, aploteti. It's a really interesting word. It deals with singleness. It's often translated singleness, but I think there's a little bit more to it. I'm looking it up here. Simplicity, sincerity, frankness. Okay. So the singleness, I think, may construe it too narrowly. It has to do with like uprightness, sincerity, and frankness. So, and then there's also another aspect of it, generosity, liberality. So, you have a different range of meaning. So is it singular? Is it sincere? Is it generous? So what is the exact kind of meaning here? When I look at the LSJ, it does say singleness as its first meaning. It does say simplicity as the second meaning. And then a third meaning is open-heartedness. And then there's actually a fourth meaning of ignorance and backwardness, which is that doesn't seem on the table. But anyway, this word, I mean, that's kind of a broad range. So singleness of your heart, is it like a focus? Is it a frankness, sincerity, like an earnestness? Or is it a liberality? And I mean, that's quite a large range here. Now, this word does occur in the Gospels. It does occur with Jesus. I think it's in the Sermon on the Mount, or at least the cognate is of living, Matthew 6:22. The eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is clear, there's the word clear. Your whole body is full of light. So clear in the sense of single, like unjaundiced. It also shows up in a yeah, so it shows up in that context, I guess. At least a cognate does. Um, Now all of this obedience to your fleshly lords, um, and the manner in which it's done. So with fear, trembling, in sincerity or generosity of your heart, that is compared to as to the Lord, as if or in a corresponding way that you obey the Lord. So there's a correspondence then, and I think then a prior more significant relationship that Paul appeals to is that the servants have a relationship to the Lord. and all believers, in fact, are, Paul uses the same term for all believers, that we're servants or slaves of Christ. So everybody who belongs to Jesus is a slave to him. He is our Lord. And so when addressing slaves or servants as a subset of the larger body of believers, really he's just saying you already are doing this to the Lord Jesus. So now, in a like way, you do this to your earthly masters, your masters who in the flesh you have this relationship with. Now, these slaves didn't have an option usually. They were conquests, spoils of conquest, and then sold into the larger population. Some people maybe gave themselves up to it because they couldn't sustain themselves. This was kind of a way to make sure that you had a roof over your head and bread in your belly to become a slave. So we don't know the circumstances. Regardless, those slaves had a relationship with the Lord. That's the fundamental relationship. And within that fundamental relationship, that governs how they relate to their masters. Now, we saw something similar with, husbands and wives, obviously, because they're submitting to one another, out of being filled with the Spirit, wives to their own husbands as to the Lord. So there's the fundamental relationship once again. The wife is submitting to her husband as to the Lord. So there's something similar going on here. Now we're going to get a continued description of what this looks like, the manner of it, and it's quite a list here. And I'm going to start to just do a little bit um, of sentence arrangement here, because we're going to see that Paul's going to continue to elaborate what this looks like. And yeah, we're going to see that it kind of comes to a conclusion here. So first off, we see a may Allah construction. So uk Allah, may Allah uh, sets up a corrective understanding. And so here we're getting more elaboration. The elaboration comes by way of a denial, and a negative denial, and a positive affirmation. So talking about the negative thing first, and then a correction with the positive thing. So not according to eye service. So not being a servant by way of eye service. Literally, it is eye service. That's a fun word because that's literally what it means. Ophthalmo dulion, eye service. So not in the way of, according to the standard of eye service. So kata can indicate standard, a standard. So not in this standard, not in this standard way of how slaves typically do this, right? And I think we all kind of know this if we've worked places before where we're under like a strict supervision. When the boss walks in, everyone kind of chimes up a certain way. If you're working at a restaurant and the owner walks in, sometimes people, they'll stop talking crassly. They'll change their demeanor. They'll look like they're busy. So I think we've all been in situations where maybe we've done this or we've seen it being done. So this is the kind of thing that we're talking about, so that it looks good. It only looks good when the master is present. So not according to eye service, where it just looks good. And then there's a further qualification of that, as pleasing people. Anthropo RSQ. This is a nice word where, again, you can see the that it's a compounded word, and Yeah, so here's the anthropo, the person part, and the people pleaser. And then this is the word for pleasing, the root stem. So as pleasing people, but, and then here's the correction, but as servants of Christ. So this is the framework, right? This is the model of what they are supposed to be doing. Now, I think the as servants of Christ is is going to be inclusive of this participle as servants, but rather as servants of Christ doing, doing. So what's happening here is that the obedience is being elaborated by way of this model of being servants of Christ. So this oath clause here begins to achieve this kind of transition, this kind of framework, obeying as to Christ. And now Paul is going to be elaborating the manner of how they are to be servants or obedience under the rubric of servants of Christ. Okay, so that this is really important. This is this is this is describing what their manner and what they are to be like. They are to be like in their role of servants to earthly masters. They have a more fundamental capacity, our more fundamental reality, namely that they're servants of Christ. So really, they're double servants. They're double agent servants, and that's done intentionally. I'm saying that intentionally because what they're doing when they're servants of Christ is they're doing the will of God, doing the will of God. Now, what is the will of God in Ephesians? If you look across Ephesians, God has revealed his plan and purposes, which are basically to save the whole world. He is savior of the body in the previous pericope. If you do a look at God's will in Ephesians, it is that we would be remade in the image of his son, that we be adopted as God's sons, that there's and daughters, that there's a one new humanity in which there's reconciliation of Judeans and Gentiles into one body. So I would posit here that the will of God, the will of the Lord, is actually um, mission. It's outreach. It is evangelism, building up the body of believers, building up numerically, building up morally in terms of virtue. And I would suggest that this is, in fact, a missional understanding, a self-understanding. Paul is trying to say that you servants are servants of Christ, and you should be doing the will of God. And that means seeking to bring people into relationship with others. And we need to remember, if you're thinking, that can't be what it means, look at the movement of Ephesians, particularly chapter 5 ends with this right before being filled with the Spirit. It ends with this idea of us being light in the world and bearing fruit of righteousness. And being light means that we're confronting the darkness and we're helping people have this encounter where Christ shines on them. Awake, O sleeper, and Christ will shine on you. That is conversion. That is conversion. So the Ephesians 5, prior to the being filled with the Spirit, comes to this moment of conversion, of light confronting darkness and bringing people to to the gaze of Christ, where they're converted. Then he says, be filled with the Spirit, and making the most of our day, because and be aware of what God's will is. And God's will is, and here I'm just going to show you the text here. So this is Ephesians. So walk carefully, as not as unwise but as wise, making the most of the opportunity, buying up the time. And in the context, the parallel passage in Colossians, and here we need to go to Colossians. Conduct yourselves with wisdom towards outsiders, making most of the opportunity. This has to do with evangelism, speaking grace, if you go to the context. And so again, I'm connecting these dots, knowing, but understand what the will of the Lord is. So what is the will of the Lord? Well, the will of the Lord is to make the most of our time, which means letting our speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt, that you know how to respond to each person. Okay? So this is evangelism. This is evangelism. So Paul, when he's saying to servants, knowing what the will of the Lord is, he is, in fact, calling them to evangelize their masters by way of their good conduct. By way of their good conduct, that they are furthering the will of God in their respective household settings. And that is a very high calling. So to doing the will of the Lord, from the soul, from deep inside of who they are, from the soul. And I think this is an interesting qualification. Now, we don't know, what this from the soul is modifying. There is a comma put here. Let me see if this, yeah, I think it's typical to put the from the heart as modifying the will of God, doing the will of God. Now, I find it intriguing that he uses the word that can construe one's eternal self, when he's talking about doing the will of God. From your eternal self, because what that does is it recalls the fact that we ourselves are eternal or everlasting beings. Like God has made us to be, that we have a life after this life that we have, that our soul is not just about bios living, physical living, bios life. It is a zoe life. And so while we remember and live out of the fact that we have an eternal destiny that God has prepared for us, what that means is that as we do the will of God, we do the will of God knowing that others also are invited into that eternal life, and they have souls. They have souls. I mean, it literally is an SOS situation for us in the world. Save our souls. That's what SOS means. Save our souls. And so they're doing the will of God out of their own eternal selves, knowing that masters have eternal selves and souls that need to be brought into a loving relationship with the Lord above. And that relationship is going to be on display in just a little bit, the possibility of that relationship. So serving, then we get a further explanation of what that doing looks like. Now, I think the serving is modifying the doing. So doing the will of God from the heart. So will is the direct object of doing. Then you have from the soul, indicating the origin out of which this doing occurs. And then we have delevontes, serving, which is modifying poiuntos. So that's why I'm dropping these down. Each of these is a modifier, and you can start to, count these modifiers. So the first modifier is from the soul, which is itself, and then you have serving, which is a modifier of servant, of serving. Yeah, so this is self is a modifier with goodwill. So you're serving with goodwill. And this goodwill is different than, according to the eye service, and not pleasing people, like just for it to look good. But this is actually like a good mindedness, unias, a good disposition, serving, as this is done. And then you're serving as to the Lord. And so here we have another modifier, as to the Lord, and not to people. So we're coming back around, not pleasing people, not pleasing them, but rather serving as to the Lord and not to people. All right, so we're getting a lot of explanation here of how to serve, and we're seeing prepositions of manner. This meta is kind of conveying that. The n is conveying that, probably maybe an interior space in this realm of that is related to the heart. And then we're seeing these os clauses, which are describing like the manner, and but also there's like a comparison of how this is done, as to. So there's two tiers to the relationship. The fundamental relationship is that we're servants. The servants have a relationship serving Christ, and this relationship influences, governs, shapes the human scale servant-master relationship. In fact, that servant-master relationship is completely re-envisioned and subordinated to the Christ relationship, such that the servants, Paul gives them a mission that they do the will of God from their own eternal souls, knowing that they have a master who has an eternal soul as well. And so then they serve with a good disposition towards their master in light of God's will to have them save and join the Christ relationship. And so they do this to the Lord, as to the Lord. They're serving as to the Lord. So the Lord is really wants to use them in their circumstances. And this is really the great news. Wherever we are, the Lord wants to use us in those circumstances that we find ourselves. And this is Paul's point in 1 Corinthians 7. Wherever that may be, the Lord has called us in that circumstance, and he wants us to be a light and to be a witness to who he is in that circumstance. Okay, now what informs all of this, probably this test, we have to decide, what does it modify? Is it modify serving as the Lord, or does it continue this drop down? Is this the third modifier of doing the will of God? And I think it probably is. So I'm going to keep the 3 there. So this doing is modified by from the soul, serving as to the Lord, and knowing that. So here we have a very strong, well, I think it's strong because it's perfective, or it's a resultative aspect. Knowing, that's why it's got a yellow highlight. Knowing, and then the knowing is this content of that each person is going to receive from the Lord whatever good they did. So whatever good each person does, this he will receive from the Lord. Whether he be a slave or free. And that's significant that he's ending with that freedom, because that also is a possibility that slaves can become free. Everybody, this is an equalizing statement. Everybody, whether slave or free, is going to be judged according to the good that they've done. A judgment according to goodness. That this is what the Lord wants. The Lord wants us to do the good. He wants us to do the good. So let's break down this this content clause. So basically, the OT here is the content of the knowing, and this knowing is providing a rationale, a support for doing the will of God and serving with kindness, knowing that each person, um, whatever he does. So this ekastos is fronted in front of the clause that it belongs in. And you can see there's a textual variant here. See these little marks here? These words are going to be transposed to put ekastos properly inside of its clause. And so, there's a textual variant there. Scribes are trying to fix the grammar. Probably makes sense. But this does make sense here. This is, if it's fronted like this is something called grammatical prolepsis. And I first learned this term from my classical professor, University of Kentucky, when I was getting my classical master's degree. Grammatical prolepsis, which means that it's pulled out in front of its clause for stress. It's for stress. It also is gray boxed, which gray highlighted, which means that it's specifying quantity. And here it's construing each individual person. And there's stress. There's stress on this. And we know that there's stress on this because of its frontedness. Also, its further elaboration here at the end. This particularization, the ita is that the tab part of this is saying that there's similar things in the context. So the ita is a correlative emphasis, I would call it. E is a conjunction which stresses possibility. So whether the person be a servant or whether the person be both, whether the person is a servant or whether they are a servant. So these are conditional statements here. This is a conditional statement. So really, there's so much here going on, because this is also a conditional statement here, the o-an. The o-an is a relative pronoun construction. And so it's also setting up a supposition based around the idea of the good, whatever the good that is done, whatever the good each one does. So that's a condition. So it's a type of conditional sentence, and it is a future, more vivid condition. So on with the subjunctive followed by the future indicative. So it's a future more vivid, but its subtype is a relative conditional clause. You can have temporal conditional with otan or eos on. You could have manner conditions, however. You can have locative, wherever. So there's different subtypes of conditions. So this is grammatical prolepsis. It's stressed. We know it's stressed because of the particularization at the end. And I need to come back to the second condition here. The ita doulos ita eleutheros. This is another protasis. So this is a protasis here. This first one is a protasis. That is the supposition. This is a protasis. This is protasis one of a future, more vivid condition. And if you want to read more about these, look at my Koine Greek Grammar, chapter 26. So this is protasis number one. But there's also another protasis here. And it's a compound double protus with eta. This is protasis number one, or number two, and maybe three, if we want to, get technical, because there's two etas. Now, E is a conjunction that works with the indicative mood. So now we have, since we have two different protasis types, you got a future more vivid with the subjunctive, on with the subjunctive. Now we have E with the indicative implied, which is a different type of condition. So when you have E with the indicative followed by the conclusion, which is future tense, komizete, will receive. Now we're looking at maybe a mixed condition if this is future tense or present tense implied, because we don't have any verbs here, it's just a verb of being, whether he is a servant or whether he is a free person. So if we understand those as present tense, then we have a mixed condition, present simple protasis with a future more vivid conclusion. But I'm going to suggest something else to you. This, I think, is I think we could imply we could say that these are future time framed. And why this is so significant is because if this is E with a implied future form of imi, whether he is in the future servant or slave, and I think that is the time frame. Then you have E with the future indicative implied, followed by a future indicative in the conclusion. And if you look at Koine Greek Grammar, chapter 26, that would be classified as a future most vivid condition. And what's significant about that is that these are conditions, they're often used for warnings, which is fitting here because basically there's a real sense that how we live now, doing the good or not, will be judged in the future. There's a bit of a warning, like this is presented vividly, this situation that we will give an account of ourselves from the Lord. The Lord is going to reward us for the good. So anyway, I think that's interesting to see where Paul, and he does this in 2 Corinthians, where he can use two different types of protases with the same conclusion. And I also have to mark this down as another instance of that. It's a wild construction that we have going on here. Now, it's wild in the sense that ekastos is fronted proleptically. There's also something else going on here. You have a topical frame, you have a framework that's fronted, and then you have the pronominal trace, the tuto. The tuto basically is the trace picking up the relative pronoun, whatever good. This he will receive from the Lord. Okay, so this is called a left dislocated topic. So what this means is that, we got to color this. This whole thing is being pulled out to the front, and then there's a trace that picks it back up. And this is the definition of a left dislocated framework. And now we have to think of, well, why is Paul using this framework? Why is he setting this up? Why is he using this construction? From what I could discover, and I think I looked at this in my Koine Greek Grammar, chapter 21, I looked at these frameworks and left dislocated frameworks and topics, is that they indicate some discontinuity in the immediate context, like right here, maybe. Like there's a bit of a break. So we're not serving people knowing that. And then there's some discontinuity with that human scale thinking. We're breaking from that because in fact there's going to be a future judgment. So it could be that this verse is showing some discontinuity because prior to this, it's kind of like we're thinking about things kind of human scale. Yeah, the Lord's will and this kind of stuff. But there's kind of a focus on how do we live now and stuff. But there's discontinuity in the sense that there is actually going to be a future reward, a future judgment implied in that. And so that's the that's why you have this disjunction, this slight disjunction, and that's what is communicated by this construction. All right, a lot of fun here. So this is a pretty gnarly verse. Okay, there's a lot of qualification as we go down through here. Paul is really trying to get this right with the servants, trying to get them the proper framework of evangelism. But let's not stop there. We got one more verse, and I think I can do this. We can do this. We can finish it. And masters, vocative. Do, be doing, present active indicative, present active imperative, be doing, to avta. There's it's fronted direct object. It's violating the word order for stress sake. Well, as also just it's the more known entity too. So do the same things. This is special use of the third person personal pronoun avtos. When the article accompanies it, it means the same. It means sameness. And here it's neuter plural. The same things. Be doing present imperative to them. To them. Okay. This is actually functioning like the indirect object, and yet it's a prepositional phrase. I had to look at that. When I looked at that, when I do this marking, it helps me to see things because I put this in parentheses because it's a prepositional phrase, but then it's actually functioning direct object. This is the only place in the New Testament that I could find with the verb pieo. It usually takes the dative case for its direct object, indirect object. Here, it's using the prepositional phrase, which is ramping up the prominence. And pros, if you look at my Koine Greek grammar, when I talk about the preposition pros, it marks closeness, proximity. And so what's going on here? Paul says, do the same things to the servants. Masters, do the same things that I've been describing up above to them. Wow, that is, talk about a mockery. Talk about a turning on its head. This is just confounding to me. It's stunning what Paul does here. He's gone into such detail qualifying os and not this, but this, these participles culminating with this wonky sentence, this huge eschatological sentence in verse 8 with all the grammatical stuff going on. The marking is intense. And then he says, you masters do the same things to them. I'm just floored by it. This is amazing. And then he has some sentence qualifiers. And I'm going to layer this because he's gonna be modifying doing. He says not threatening, giving up the threatening. So the doing is modified by this. So this is modifying. If I push it over, it's going to go off the screen. So so giving up the threatening. So don't do that. Why? Why do we give up the threatening and why do we do to them the same things? Knowing that. Well, here we're in the same realm as we were just in, knowing that also. So this cache should be blue text in the database because it's being used adverbally also. theirs and ours. Fronted, fronted genitives. Wow. Okay, that's for stress. Theirs, both theirs and ours. Actually, I take that back. The ke is functioning with a ke construction. Both theirs and ours. This is good, properly good. So their Lord is in heaven. In other words, it's the same Lord. And what else about this Lord who is a shared Lord? It's not multiple lords. The Lord is the same of the servants and the masters. It's the same Lord. Um, and there is no respecter of persons with him. No respecter of persons with him. He doesn't care. He doesn't give a rip. God doesn't care whether you're a master or slave. He is going to hold you accountable regardless. Regardless, he's going to hold you accountable. All right, so I see a question here. Yeah, the question is doing the same things, what is that picking up exactly? Is it picking up, serving the Lord? Um, I would, what does this go back to? I think that's a really good question. Um, I think it must, I think it must be broader than just serving because it's plural. Um, So I think it's doing the will of God. In other words, evangelism. You're trying to win over your slaves to serve the Lord. I think it includes serving as to the Lord. I don't know. Serving, yeah. If it's I think it's an open it's an open question. I think that's what makes it so subversive. Is there a mutual serving taking place? Just and this would go back to submitting to one another, being filled with the Spirit. Paul says submitting to one another. So is there some sense in which masters are submitting to their servants? I would say so. I would say so. If indeed, um, what leads to the household codes is this verse right there, submitting to one another in the fear of Christ, which, by the way, this is not belonging to husbands and wives. This is very problematic to put this here because this participle is joining the other participles that are hanging off of the verb be the command to be filled in the Spirit. And then you have this participle, you got these participles, you got these